Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to Off the Record. We're going to have a conversation with Catherine Pakaluk and Mary Margaret Olahan, and then we'll have a Q&A after, so start thinking about your questions as they're speaking. You'll get to ask that at the end. Just really quickly to introduce Catherine. Catherine is an American economist and social philosopher at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. I'm going to do the whole thing. She completed her doctoral work in economics at Harvard under Nobel laureate Oliver Hart. Very cool. Ms. Pakaluk is the author of the groundbreaking ethnography, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. She and her husband are parents to 14 children, 6 from Michael's first marriage, and 2 Ruth Pakaluk, deceased in 1998, and 8 from their family in 1999. And then we're also going to have this conversation moderated by Mary Margaret. She's the senior reporter at the Daily Signal. Daily Wire. Yeah, she's at the Daily Wire, where she covers preeminent cultural and political stories of the moment, including the protection of children's innocence, the struggles of biological women to maintain the integrity of their sports and spaces, Me Too allegations against powerful politicians, and the coronavirus's pandemic's effect on children. She has previously written for the Daily Wire, where she has returned to, and the Daily Caller. She is a graduate of Catholic and proud to be the oldest daughter in an Irish Catholic family of 11 children. Welcome our ladies tonight, guys.
Thank you so much. Oh, this, okay, perfect. Thank you.
Right, well.
It is on.
Hello? I'll just project.
How'd that work?
Well, thank you everybody
Nice.
for coming. This is such an honor to have this conversation with Catherine, who's one of my heroes. Hannah's Children is a really amazing, well thought out book. One of the only ones I have ever seen on big families, and it's very special to me as the oldest daughter in a family of 11 children. I'm so very grateful to Catherine for doing this.
Thanks.
Before we start our conversation, though, Catherine, I want to give you an opportunity to just share with everyone why you wrote this book and any of your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think my mic might be turned up a little too loud or something. So just wave at me if it's killing you off. Okay. How about that? Is that good? Oh, that's better. Much better. All right, great. So I think, hi. So first of all, hi. It's great to be here with you guys. I work at Catholic University, and we're not that far away, but I don't come down to the Hill very often. So when I do, it's nice to be here, and especially now. Like we're so exciting. Everything's great. So I feel like in some sense, I hardly need to tell you why I wrote this book. On the other hand, there is kind of a story, so I may as well go through it. And when I say that I don't need to tell you, like I assume you're all reading all the headlines. You know, we're getting hit by them constantly right now about how there's not enough babies in the world. No one's having enough babies. The United States isn't having enough babies. You're seeing, these dreadful headlines about countries that are way worse off than we are, notably South Korea, really, really low. 0.5 children expected to be born per woman in the city of Seoul. So, are we going to be there soon or what? We're just above 1.5. So that's really, so in a sense, I don't need it. But that being said, when I wrote this book, it was not, well, no, by the time I wrote the book, it was a big deal. But when I started the research for the book, it was not yet a big deal, but I thought it would be. And so there are a couple of ways I could describe the beginning of this book. And maybe I'll tell you the two sides. Sort of there is the economic side. So I'm a professional economist. And so kind of like, how do economists think about the problem, and what was the puzzle to be addressed? Because that was part of the thought. I'm sitting around thinking, like, what should I write next? Maybe this is something I should work on. So there's a sort of economic side, but then there's kind of a sociological side, and they both kind of converged, and they're both in the book. And the economic side is kind of it touches on this trend of low birth rates. So kind of the story was like, I'm just going to summarize for you. When I was growing up, the thought in the 80s and the 90s was kind of like the whole world isn't having enough children and we are fine in the United States. And so people consistently wrote articles, really coming out of Washington, D.C., kind of about American exceptionalism in that respect. Like we were better. We were not as bad. I was too young at the time to be following it as a professional. But when I look back on it, it's hard for me to tell what data people were looking at and whether they were trying to tell a nice story and kind of intentionally missing the granular pieces of it, or whether there was some wish to sort of misrepresent the trends. And what I mean is this: the reason the sort of the general and typical birth rates in the U.S. were looking more rosy in the U.S. in the 80s and the 90s than in Europe and in Asia is because really generally because of immigration prior to 2001. And so I kind of wonder, because some of the people who are writing about how much better we were really should have known better than to kind of not, should have known to tease out the immigration effect. I can't judge that, but I will say that the data that we have today, and I assume it was available to people already in the 1990s, would say that the total fertility rate, the TFR in the United States, was below replacement level. This is the CDC's statement, below replacement level generally already in the 1970s, in case you didn't know that, like in the 1970s, and has been consistently since 1980. So that transition for us to below replacement fertility rates happened a long time ago. So people who want to sell the story of falling birth rates as kind of like a new phenomenon or something that's kind of related to like the recent ups and downs of policy or what's going on, or, you know, like how expensive housing is, like they're definitely not telling you the whole story, or they just don't know the whole story. So you really have to account for what happened between, you know, more or less 1960 and 1975. So you can probably think of a few things, right? So, all right, so there's that piece. So then basically economists are like looking at these trends, and then basically what happens is things are looking bad in the 2000s, early, you know, the first decade, immigration starts to drop precipitously. Then you have the Great Recession and birth rates again. There's a kind of inflection point in 2009, 2010, and more or less like economists start writing pieces around 2011 and 12, like professional economists in journals nobody reads, saying like it went down again and we're not really sure why, but we think it's the recession and it will probably rebound. And then like you go out 2 more years and they're going, it didn't rebound. So like what is going on? We need to reevaluate. So that was sort of on the econ side. So that takes you up to like 2014, 2015 when I'm starting to think about it. And I'm thinking, well, maybe there's more of a story here. And so on the econ side, there was really, the thought was sort of quite a simple one. It was just that, number one, I come out of a tradition in economics, which is quite critical of the use of statistical aggregates. And what I mainly mean is sort of like, you know, you're never going to really learn the story by looking at averages, because averages do what they do, but actually a lot of the action is really in the different buckets. What are, you know, what's happening at the lower quintile, the upper quintile. You kind of have to like dig in. You got to get past the aggregate. So I thought, well, it would be really interesting, right? So if the birth rate, like let's just say the birth rate is at 1.5, you can have that birth rate in 2 different ways. You can have 1.5 children per woman if every person who has children has 1.5, right? Or you can have 1.5 as some kind of weighted average across the buckets of people who have 0 children, people who have 1 child, people who have 2 children, 4, 5, and you can keep going. So then the question is like, what happened with the buckets? Like, is our situation one in which everybody has 1.5 or everyone has, you know, 1.6? Or is it that there's significant movement around in the buckets? So we know that actually the people sitting in the buckets have changed a lot. So we know that one of the biggest changes since I was born in the 70s is how many more people are childless, right? So have no children at all. So that's, you know, obviously if you have a lot of zeros in there, that's going to change your average significantly. So it started to make me wonder, well, like, what do the buckets look like? And if you really did have just a single deterministic trend, right? Like housing is too expensive, groceries cost too much, like no one's getting paid enough, middle class wages are stagnating. Like think of all of those things. If you really had that, then you would see that everybody's buckets looked the same, like everybody moved in the same direction. And we'd start to look into it. You're like, actually, everybody isn't moving in the same direction. There's some people shifting downward, and there's other people whose fertility has stayed the same, if not has gone up. And I thought that's got to be worth looking into. Like, what the heck is going on with that? Well, then there's no quantitative data you can look at that point. You have the numbers. You're like, I need to know why this is happening, right? Okay, so that kind of takes you up to like my book and what I did. And in a minute, I'll just give you like the 30-second explanation. There's a really important question there, which is, if you have statistical outliers, are they relevant for the overall trend and for the policy solutions you might come up with? Or are they just crazy people on the fringe? Right? Could just be crazy people. And you could go out and interview them and maybe you'd find out like they're crazy. That would be good. It would be good to like bring that back and be like, yep, I talked to them. They're all crazy. We don't need to pay any attention to them. They're just as crazy as you thought. They're like all like the Duggar family or whatever reality TV show you think, their sister wives or whatever. Okay. So that was the goal, was to figure out if the statistical outliers are important for the policies. In the back of my mind on that side, the econ side, of course, already like 10 years ago, like anybody's paying attention to Hungary, that didn't happen yesterday. That whole system of pronatalist policies that Viktor Orban put in place, we're now like 14 years into that. So of course, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, we really have to know if this kind of thing is going to work. Because on the other hand, I'm like, all of the countries are bankrupt. They're desperately bankrupt. So we probably can't afford to put like sizable payments on trying to get people to have kids. Of course, you're like, is this going to work? So that was the motivation on that side. And really quickly on the sociological side, there was this whole other literature, which I think today might be a good time to point you back to it if you're not familiar with it. There was a very sort of sad but sort of tragic book that came out. I'm going to forget what year it was published. I want to say like 2017. So it was a couple years before I started mine. It was called Cheap Sex. And it was kind of an updating of an older thesis by that sort of famous book by George Gilder. I don't know if anybody, I mean, if I'm like talking about things that are really ancient history for most of you, that George Gilder wrote a book called Men and Marriage, I think. Somebody's like seen it. So it's like an old book. It's a great book. It's an oldie but goodie. Go pick it up. And so University of Texas sociologist Mark Rigneris wrote a book called Cheap Sex. And it really looks at the impact of sort of like some of the big sort of technologies as like the birth control pill, online dating, Tinder apps, and things like that, and pornography. Kind of looks at those as like marriage disrupting technologies, particularly also work disincentivizing. So it's a great book that I think like nobody paid attention to, but I kind of think we might be better. It might have been ahead of its time. And so like Rob Henderson just circulated a page or two of it like 3 weeks ago. And I thought, good, it needs it now. It was ahead of its time. So, but that was a book about like some of the consequences of sex becoming like, sort of cheap and fast and ubiquitous and like, in a sense, like really like taken to some kind of logical extreme outside of marriage. And so when I read that book, I thought, and this is going to take you back to your comment about being from a big family. I thought, is it even possible to try to write the book, which is the other part of this? Like, who are the people who like have expensive sex? Like, I was like, what does that look like? Like people who like, when they have sex, like they're committed to like a whole thing, like a whole lifetime together, and like maybe some babies, and like paying for college and like all of that. That's all bundled up in it. It's not like, and initially I was like, no, that's like too big of a project. And here's like here's a little nugget, which is always true, which is that trying to describe things that are sort of like happy and healthy is eternally cringy. It almost shouldn't be tried, right? Like anybody who tries to depict like what it would be like to be the oldest daughter and with 11 kids, like you're going to try to describe that and it's just going to sound dumb, cheesy, like, right? I mean, even Little Women has it gets a little bit of that, right? Like, and then I'm going to ask you to name a novel about a big happy family. You're like, I can't name one. There isn't one. And there isn't one for a reason, because it's it's more difficult to capture the sublime. And of course, it's much more easy to describe dysfunction. So I thought, like, I thought about it and I was like, no, I can't go there. It's just going to be way too hard. But that was in the back of my mind. And I think at the end of the day, the book kind of aims to do that, but not, I don't ever say that explicitly in the book. But could you give people a presentation of what it would look like to live a lifestyle in which you understand sex not as a recreation, but as something which is life-giving and something which forms the basis of a lifelong bond and builds a family, provides like this lifelong unity of affection between parents who stay with their children for life. So you get a glimpse of that in the book. And I think it was worth doing because, if you're going to have lots of books about how bad everything is, you need a couple that are, simultaneously sober, but also maybe a little hopeful. So, so those are maybe from the two sides, like reasons from a research and scholarly perspective, why I thought it would be a good idea to do this. So what I do, I just went around the country and talked to a bunch of people with kids and I really just asked them two questions. Not exactly that way, but the goal was to find out why they did this. Like, what is wrong with you? Like, why would you do this ever? And what do you think it means? I learned right away that if you want to get answers to those two questions, don't ask those two questions. So there was a whole set of other questions I figured out quickly you had to ask. And then that was about a 3 or 4 month process, and then spent about 3 years trying to wrangle that into a single narrative. And so the book is called Hannah's Children. Hannah is the biblical Hannah. That was really a research finding that emerged. I had no notion of a biblical theme before I wrote the book, but that really that's what you're looking for with this kind of qualitative work. You're like, what are the common threads? What are the things that seem like a fair representation across women of such variety of religious beliefs and practices and geographic locations? So that's what. So what's in the book is the product of those questions.
So these statistical outliers we're talking about, the women that choose to have more than 5 children, we've been told by people like Emmanuel Macron that they're probably uneducated. Didn't he say, show me the woman who with a college education would have more than 5 children?
Yeah.
Why are they having all of these kids? And what were the number one, maybe the top 3 reasons, if you had them, why they chose to have such big families?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna give you a prequel to that question, which is, did they have reasons? Right? So actually, one of the things you hear all the time, I mean, which is related to Macron's question, is kind of like, is this just happening by accident to some people? Is it right? Is it something that just I don't know, just couldn't help ourselves, didn't know how that happened? Like, great. Hopefully in this room that sounds absurd, but I get that still today from some quarters if you talk about this work. And so there's 2 versions of that. Either people are just idiots and their children are accidents, basically. You were practicing the rhythm method, right? Right? There's these jokes, you get them all the time, right? So the other version of it is kind of like the way people are talking about the measles outbreak in Texas. Is kind of like there are these, people out there who are kind of like, functionally they're Mennonites or they're Amish people, or they're, we don't know, like a crazy, like literal Catholic who doesn't believe in birth control. And so then they just are hopelessly copulating. So, and that's another version, but it's, so it's out there. So actually it's helpful to come and be like, well, actually there was a whole story here, and like not knowing how this happens wasn't part of that story. So there's some pieces there. Yeah, there were three sort of really essential reasons. Everybody's story is different, and that's the beautiful thing of qualitative work. Nobody's sort of summed up by reasons, right? People have stories and they have reasons why they came to have those reasons, right? But the 3 big reasons, they said basically they believed that children were blessings. And now that takes some unpacking, right? Like, what does that mean? They believe that children are blessings, expressions of divine goodness, and the purpose of their marriages. Okay. So when I say something like the purpose of their marriages, you got these stories like, we didn't get married to wait. We were getting married to found a family. So that's what I mean there. I don't mean like, I don't think anybody that I talked to thought their marriage would be any less if they didn't have like a lot of kids or anything like that, but that they got married to have a family. and that they wanted to, they sought about to do that as if it was a goal. The way somebody might say, like, I don't know, I've got a son who has a goal to hit a bunch of peaks. He's like an outdoorsman, wants to, so he's got like a list. He wants to, so these were like goals. They wanted to get married, to have children. Okay. So that's what I mean about the purpose of their marriage. The blessings part, and this is where the biblical theme becomes really helpful. You talk to many people, and since writing the book, I've talked to a lot of people who will say this to you, especially reporters at NPR. They say, well, I think my kids are blessings too. How is this any different? I'm like, of course you do. I'm sure you do. That's wonderful. But let me explain it like this. The people I talk to believe children are blessings in the same way that most people view wealth and health. And what I mean is this. Have you ever met somebody who had kind of like undertaken the process of getting healthier or getting fit? And then they say, I've had enough of that now. I think that was good. I've had enough health for now. I'm really kind of done being healthy, right? Like, well, it's ridiculous, right? That doesn't happen. And no one says I'm done being wealthy. And I don't mean having money, because money is not the same thing as wealth, right? I'm like the economist here. Money is not the same thing as wealth. Nobody says like I'm done sort of aiming to make my life richer, fuller, wealthier, right? More prosperous. So if wealth to you is like reading more books and taking a step back at work, but people don't say like I'm done with that. And so you say to the NPR reporter, well, this is what they mean by blessings. They mean that children are something that, all things being equal, you would always want another one. And you have to put the all things being equal. It's not like people would have endangered their health or, done crazy things, but that like they definitely arranged their lives in such a way that it would be possible to have another one, because all things being equal, you wouldn't be done getting healthy and you wouldn't be done having children. Like, so they didn't like the language of done in general. So once you get that far with the NPR reporter, they're like, yep, that's different. Okay, so, but if you talk to people and you just need like a quick phrase, that's what they would say. And so of course that's it's a biblical expression. But you kind of have to drill down a few levels before you get to like, so you mean it's a blessing in the same way that like nobody in this room would reject $100 bill, as far as I know. You might reject 1,000,000 for all kinds of reasons, but you probably wouldn't reject 100. It's like something you'd never say no to, within ordinary prudence.
Now, one of my favorite lines from your book, and I just grabbed this, was your explanation for why you undertook the research. And you said, I undertook this research convinced that the study of high birth rates could shed light on the problem of low ones. So can you share with us, what did you find from the study of these high birth rates? And what does it show us about the low ones?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, first of all, it's there's a kind of simple proof by kind of contradiction in a sense, right? It's obviously not impossible to have kids today. It's obviously not too expensive to have kids today. Like all of those things are obviously not true if a bunch of people are intentionally having children. If they're accidentally having children, fine. Like it might be like, well, okay. But yeah, so it's obviously not impossible to have children. One of the ways I like to put it is that what I learned about the women with lots of kids is that having children isn't a cost problem in the way we normally think about a cost problem. We can nuance this to death. I mean, of course, like on the margin, are there people who wait to have the next kid until they can get into a different house? Are there people on the margin, at the cusp of a decision who wait for certain circumstances? Yes, but if we look at the entire trend of the thing, it can't be a cost problem, right? Because why? Because in the same time, like basically there's an inverse relationship between wealth, like people getting wealthier, and the number of kids that are produced. So it's not a problem of people not having enough resources to have children. You could drill down into that and say like, well, maybe as they get richer, they have like higher quality people. That was Gary Becker's thesis. It was like people are having it was a trade-off, quality over quantity. And there's like, no, I know, like economists are crazy. That's a real thing. It was like an entire research paradigm, and like tons and tons of people wrote lots and lots of papers on this. And it's more or less believed by all the professional economists. So they're like, well, people stopped having 5 kids because they wanted to have just 2 kids and send them to expensive colleges. I don't know. Okay, maybe that's affecting some people in some places. It explains part of it. It's true. Like people want to put every kid in their own bedroom these days. And you're like, I don't. Okay, that our grandparents didn't do that, and my parents didn't do that. So that is that a more expensive thing to do? Yeah, yes, but like none of those explanations actually line up with the inflection points in the trends. So what we're really looking at in terms of costs are kind of opportunity costs, and that's what's really happening when things get wealthier. And then when you add in the major shift of women into the workforce, which is essentially something that takes place over about a 20-year period of time. If you want to look at women's labor force participation, go do this. You guys are all mostly Hill people. Go to the St. Louis Fed and look at Fred statistics and go look at when women entered the labor force. And it's like, it's the massive shift basically happens between 1960 and 1980. And then it continues to go up a little bit, but that represents it's one way of seeing. It's not the whole part of what I call the opportunity cost, what you have to give up to have a child. Meaning missed income is not the only thing you have to give up. You also have to give up like not sleeping at night and maybe being comfortable because your legs are going to hurt and like a million other things. So I think it's all kind of summed up in like what you have to give up. So those are costs. They're personal costs. They're huge. They're subjective, but they're not the type of costs that you could redistribute your way out of. Right. So that was the thing that we sort of, well, at least I think we learned out of this, right? Because I did find a bunch of stories from people who said, yeah, like I had my first baby and I was like, wow, I'm really blessed. Like it is so easy to be pregnant. Like I just love it. I just want to have the next one right away. Yeah, there was a couple people that were like, I have relatively good pregnancies, but they had other problems. In other words, I didn't get stories of like, this is so easy for me. I feel like I should specialize in this. Which is what that would be like that explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, I mean, in my experience, and I'd be so curious to hear what you have to say about this. This is not a lifestyle that is celebrated by modern culture. In fact, a lot of mothers at the grocery store will get a lot of, what causes that jokes, and it's very countercultural. So how are these women that you spoke with accounting for this lifestyle? And do they feel accepted by modern culture? And on, along the same lines, in your research, do you find that modern culture is comfortable with big families?
I don't think my research says much about that, but I would say that the reactions to my book say a lot about that. So, there have been some really great reviews by people who were like, this is very uncomfortable. Probably the best one to that effect was Rebecca Onion's review in Slate, where she was like, on the one hand, this is incredibly fascinating. And I really like, I was surprised to find myself as I went through the book, understanding where people are coming from. I was like, I'll take it. But then at the end of the review, she's like, but I just don't want to be like them. And you're like, well, at least we know what we're talking about, right? At least that. But I thought it was a really thoughtful review, and it's worth reading. So yeah, that's to answer your question about I think it's just people don't know what to do with it because they don't actually have a narrative for it. The only narrative available to the average person, not you guys are not average probably in this room. The only narrative available to people is like is something like the rough equivalent of being like Amish or Mennonite, but worse, because actually I would say that having a lot of children still carries with it a kind of unhygienic connotation. Like you don't know how to control your bodily functions, which is certainly what Margaret Sanger thought. And certainly, so there's definitely, I think, a contribution to the modern imagination, which says that like there's something kind of like awkward and uncomfortable about this, like, right? So I think that's the thing. I think, the women I talked to, let's just be clear. I teased it out of them. I wanted to find out like, what is the worst comment you ever got in public? So they weren't volunteering that they're not sitting around feeling sorry for themselves. They generally seemed to be pretty happy people. But some of those stories were pretty sad. You should be spayed. Like, okay. Or, are these all your children? Can I ask you why? Like, why would you have all these kids? And, like at Disney, like, okay. So, there's more, but so it's the other thing I think, which might be worth mentioning at this point, maybe is people get distracted, or maybe like they're not very good in general, like following the logic, So you're like, look, the point of this research is not that we need to transition, or I think we couldn't ever, in any kind of stretch of the imagination, transition to a society in which people have 5, 6, or more children. From the research perspective, I had really limited budget, like no money. And I just had to go out and I could talk to like 50 people. So you're like, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to just grab the people that I know are going to be weird and different. And that's exactly what I want, right? So it's bang for the buck. You don't need to have a society in which everybody has 5 kids to be above replacement. Not at all. Just to the point. I mean, you could be like Israel, and like 17 to 18% of the population is this kind of category, people who really would like to have as many kids as they can, and the rest of the population doesn't. The only difference between us and Israel is that for us it's like 5%. And so if that bucket grows, actually your total fertility rate can be a lot healthier. And I think that's much more likely to be what the future holds, not some kind of situation where everyone becomes like a huge family, actually. And I think in our circles, I mean, the people, like I'm from a large family like you as well, the 9s and the 10s and the 11s are pretty unusual, like even amongst people who love children. And that's the sense in which it's a blessing. It's not, you can't go out and order them up. We know that biological fertility has fallen. People have more trouble conceiving today. People are getting married later. So I don't really see the family sizes that I profiled in the book as in any sense being sort of normative or something to aim at.
And these families that you encountered, do they have a stable family unit? Are the mother and father happy together? Does the family thrive? I know a lot of people would be curious to hear about this. There's visions of, dirty floors and fingerprints on the windows and a harassed mother who goes gray early. I think people might be curious. What does that family look like?
Okay, so that's a great question. I tried in my, I only talked to 55 people, and I want to just be fair. It's not a representative sample, so I can't say that for obvious reasons, you can't do this project that way. But if I'm drawing from what I had, I tried to present and describe the families that I met and kind of the diversity of the people that I met. So I did meet some people whose houses were kind of dirty. I was gonna say, at some phases of my life, my house was pretty dirty too. And so, yeah, there were certainly like some homes that were more chaotic, but honestly, that often, I'm trying to think, I don't think anyone's ever asked me this question. Like, I think I'm about to say something that I haven't like checked through all my data to be sure of, but I think off the top of my head, a lot of the impression of the dirtier homes probably more likely to be a wealth gradient. Like I talked to some people who are in very high, high income zip codes, and some people are in very low income zip codes. And if you're in a low income zip code, it doesn't mean you have to have poor like housekeeping strategies. It doesn't mean that at all. But it does mean that maybe you have 8 people in a very small house, and so you've got 8 coats and 8 shoes, and like all of those things are right near you, and they're not so easy to hide. So probably my impression would have been more related to wealth. But on the point about marital quality, I couldn't do a complete study, but I did ask everybody to sort of talk about their marriages. Certainly to see if there was anything I could say about the idea that kind of kids ruin your marriage, or, because actually probably like every 6 months, like Vox has a piece about how kids ruin your marriage, like every 6 months. Like someone's like, oh, time to do this one again. It's going to be, your sex life will be over forever if you have a child. Like, your bed will be terrible. It's like every 6 months, they've got like a whole folder of them. And so I thought, well, at least I'll ask them like to comment on that, because it wasn't like a primary target of the project. And I tried to be fair. Actually, in the book, I think you see the story of one of the women who has probably one of the most appealing marriages. And she talks a lot about her husband. You also see the woman who clearly doesn't have like what we would all consider like the best possible marriage. There's a lot of like trusting in God in her marriage. So she's like, well, she says, I think it's not exactly what I had imagined for marriage. She's like, but I can see how, my husband is growing and God is leading us to be better people. And, so reading, like, reading between the lines, you're like, okay, they're not incredibly in love, like in the way that we would say it. But there's something really important and gritty and beautiful in that. She's obviously, she talks a lot about her faith and how much her faith sustains them. So certainly there wasn't I would say most of the marriages were like the first case, maybe like with some variation. So certainly like a lot of happy stories and a lot of stories of, I think this is a beautiful point, like a lot of stories of women talking about how they loved their husbands more through seeing them as fathers, that they had something new to love about their husbands and to appreciate in them, and that there was a kind of only when they had some kids did they see more deeply the complementary nature of their strengths as men and women, which is really interesting, right? If you don't have kids around in a marriage, it's actually easier to live your marriage, and in a way, as like two partners who are just kind of these equal partners, just doing your whatever it is, your professional work, your hobbies, whatever it is. But children have a tendency, especially if you've got more than a couple, to really need us to lean into our male-female gifts, right? Like who's going to be, I mean, I did profile one, but it was just one that I could find. But in general, if you have like 5 kids, mom is not going to be the primary breadwinner at that point. Usually there's one. And so then there's this, like, so one woman I interviewed who was an academic and had come out of a very like very left-wing progressive academic program, met her husband there too. She said, when we started marriage, we thought it was going to be like this super egalitarian thing. We were so progressive. It's like the more kids we have, the more we're like, we look really traditional. And she's like, she said, I think honestly, when I look back, I'm surprised at how traditional we look. And she's like, it's not because we believe in tradition. It's just because this works. And it's like, okay, all right, that's actually pretty interesting. But then there's that romance of needing the strengths of the other person. So there's kind of education in that, which I think, when we're looking at all the gender confusion and the things that you write about and I wouldn't want to write about, I think like one of the reasons people have forgotten what our genders are for is because we aren't in a position very often or for much of our lives where you're like, oh, you have breasts, they have milk in them. Like that's special. Like I don't have that at all. Right? And like just to sort of, if you live that for 20 years, like you're not gender confused. You're like very, very clear about this. So one lady said, well, if you have a bunch of kids with a man, he's either going to become a jerk or a rock star. And she's like, now let me tell you about my husband. He's like such a rock star. I thought that was great. Later, I met her husband and I was like, great guy. So I think that's great. I think there's a path through this data, which isn't in this book, and I hope it will be in the next book, to writing about kind of some of the unsung virtues of maleness, which we could talk for hours about the problems with feminism, but one of the lost pieces of this heritage of traditional marriage is a lack of understanding of the strengths of the male as a dad, as a breadwinner. And so it's like opened up this vacuum of like, one side screaming about toxic masculinity and the other side is like Andrew Tate. And it's like, isn't there room for anything else? Like, great.
So on that note, I mean, I guess there's room for the Elon Musks, right? Who go out into the world and father 13 children now.
Yeah.
And
but
the journalists
that we know of,
right.
that we know of, that he knows of.
True. There could be more. And the journalist in me needs to ask you, like, on this more newsy question before we open it up for Q&A.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? This new turn of the culture, where there definitely is a portion of the Republican Party or conservatives who are embracing the idea that just more kids in general is what we want.
Yeah. Yeah. This is going to be one of the fracturing points of the right, so to speak, right? It's like we're seeing this, on IVF for sure. I should have brought it with me. And, if anybody really wants to laugh, if you've had enough drinks, when you write a book like this, you do get some weird emails. You must have some real some real winners in your
Get
inbox.
marriage proposals. People are
You
so
do?
nice to me. I don't understand why.
Oh, I have an email from about a week ago. Some dude is like, I think that you should talk more about how cloning is the answer. And I'm like, oh my gosh. It's like it was like a whole paragraph about how, I'm like, okay, do you actually know anything about me? Like, it's not really very likely to support that. Anyway, cloning, IVF, surrogacy, obviously, and then whatever Elon Musk represents. I don't know, serial. There's not even a name in sociology for that. So yeah, what do we do with that? I mean, on the one hand, right, like at least someone like Musk, what we can say that if we're going to grab something good in that, which was it's like it's wonderful to have very high profile people working with, let's just say, a coalition Republican administration, willing to say how important it is that we orient the future around having children. Okay. At that point, maybe if we don't have much more in common after that, but I think that's valuable. And of course, Trump's, Trump's not a slouch as a dad. Seems like he's been rather fecund. So I don't know what to make of that. I mean, but I will say, I mean, Musk certainly he shows up at like natal stuff and talks about how there should be more kids, and that's appreciate that, at least in its bare bones. Gets people to think about it. So there's that. So this is clearly going to be one of these points. There's going to be a bunch of these points that are going to fracture. They're going to like lead to like wider fissures on the right, and we should be prepared for that. But I guess I'll go ahead and give you my Gollum explanation for Musk in this room. We almost got to the end without a Tolkien reference, but we didn't do it. So I think about like Rogan and Musk. I think to some extent on this, we don't identify Joe Rogan yet with like being pronatal, but it might happen. If anybody can reach Joe Rogan, let me know. It'll happen. But here's the way to think about some of these guys. I think the way I think about it anyway is like you need Gollum. Gollum is like this kind of crazy creature, and he is. I mean, is he good? Is he bad? It's not really clear, but he's really useful. He's really helpful, and he's on the right team. And I think that on some level, like that's how I see Musk. Like I'm certainly not kicking him out. You know what I mean? Like he's in the coalition, and that's great. And so it's got some kind of weird wisdom to it, and I'm not in charge of that, so I can live with it. Let's put it that way.
All right. Well, I know you all have questions for Catherine, so I'll open it up